thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Unlike the previous presentations on the panel, mine is not focused on a particular country. It's sort of at a broad thematic level. There are also no slides. I enjoy being the center of attention, so we'll keep it here. The paper I'm presenting is titled More or Less Sovereign, UN Peacekeeping, Consent Management, and Sovereignty in International Law, which sounded like a really sweet title when I came up with it, but what does it actually mean? So there's a short version, a medium version, a long version, right? The long version is my actual thesis, so hopefully that comes out and hopefully that's published and all of that. The short version is that sovereignty is fundamentally incompatible with peacekeeping. So sovereignty is why UN peacekeeping does not work. And at some point of time when sovereignty stops working, UN peacekeeping will be a big piece of why it stopped working. That I recognize that that's a fairly bold claim. And so the medium version, the next 14 minutes or so, is about trying to establish how or why I believe that. So the question that really drove this came out of a frustration with UN peacekeeping in particular, but with international organizations' engagement with peace processes and with peace building in general. And it's not so much a frustration with the effect of those interventions. What's frustrating is that we don't really have a framework to assess, describe, or compare those effects in the first place, right? So, like any self-respecting 20-something-year-old, you say there is no framework. I say, okay, I'll go devise it. 60-year-old me is looking back and going, what were you thinking? But it's early days yet. And so I started with this very operational question of how do you define the success of a peacekeeping operation or any sort of peace-building intervention, international organization intervention into post-conflict states? But there's a context to this, right? And the context is this traditional peacekeeping was sort of you go and stand between the armies of two states and you're monitoring a ceasefire while they engage in a broader peace process and you just provide them a little buffer to trust each other that they hold to the ceasefire while that happens. Peacekeeping operations today are by and large deployed into situations of, within quotes, internal conflict, right? And there's usually regional and international elements in any of those conflicts, but only one of the parties in that conflict is formally recognized as a state. And so, this is a completely different kettle of fish, as it were. So in trying to get at that operational question of when are peacekeeping operations successful, I very quickly found myself moving to this broader question of what is the effect of UN peacekeeping on sovereignty writ large, right? Which I'm guessing is why I come to be on a political systems panel on shifting global systems. I'm a psychologist and a lawyer by training. I hadn't picked up a political science book until a year ago. But I had to because there was no way that I could answer this question without really getting into the political science pieces. And there are multiple pieces that are necessary to really build this framework and make the argument work. I'm going to go through a very abridged version. And the centerpiece of that framework is to think of peacekeeping as a form of negotiation. So I was very happy to see Professor Loftus was moderating our panel. But let me talk through sort of the structure of that negotiation, the content of that negotiation, and then what I think is the effect of that negotiation, right? So the first piece of that structure is that it's happening within the context of the United Nations. And this matters for a number of reasons, most of which have to do with the Charter of the UN itself and what that means for international law. Reason one, who is involved with the UN? Who is involved with peacekeeping within the ambit of the UN? Well, it's states, right? And it's member states of the UN. And one of the effects of the UN Charter has been that if you are not a member of the UN, your claim to statehood is suspect/dismissed. the second effect is that if you are a member of the UN, well, then there's a norm of sovereign equality of member states. Not only are you presumed to be sovereign, you're also presumed to be as sovereign as every other state. So Tuvalu is as sovereign as the United States, and vice versa. We're not sure who is more horrified about that. The third factor about it being out of the UN is that originally the idea may have been that the United Nations was just a forum. It was a cipher. It was maybe the 5 permanent members of the Security Council that actually enacted what they wanted to happen. But over the course of 70 years, the UN has evolved a structure and an agency of its own. So today, when you talk about a UN intervention in a particular country, it is true that it's there at the behest of the global community, but the UN has its own agency and presence in that, right? The UN is also an actor in its own right, while still being a forum. So that's one piece of the structure, is the UN. The other piece of the structure is that the peace operation is going into, as I said, internal conflict, right? Where only one of the parties is recognized as a state, but then the odds are that the other parties to the conflict have some sort of association, affiliation with other states, have some sort of association or affiliation with different power elements within the state where the conflict is going on. My primary case study, and I'm not going to get through it in the presentation, I'm happy to do it in Q&A, but my primary case study was Darfur, which is as thoroughly internationalized a conflict as you can find. So what this means is that when a peace operation is deployed to a situation of internal conflict, what's really going on is this trilateral negotiation between the international actors, the state-level actors, and the various sub-state and non-state actors that are also in some way party to or affected by the conflict or can play a role in its resolution. So that, I mean, again, that's the structure. What are they actually negotiating? On the one hand, it's whatever the peace operation is mandated to do, right? Those mandates in themselves are interesting, and if you track the way that those mandates have evolved over time, they've gone from things like just ceasefire monitoring to famously protection of civilians, first tried out in Sierra Leone, modestly successful there, currently mandated to happen in places like South Sudan, where if you're following what happened in the last 48 hours, camps are being attacked while UN peacekeepers are present. So clearly not as successful there. Or to things like, and this is my favorite mandating phrase, extension of state authority, which you have to really pause and think about it. If you're extending, if the UN is coming into the state as an agent of the state and interacting with non-state actors to extend state authority to areas that are controlled by those non-state actors, clearly you're a party to the conflict, right? One, you're a party to the conflict. Two, it means that what you're negotiating is not just a mandate. You're negotiating the sovereignty of the state itself. And specifically, its domestic sovereignty, its sovereignty over its own territory. Which is really, to get back to why this was frustrating for me, which is hard to measure. Because nowhere in the UN Charter, nowhere in any of the resolutions that mandates a peace operation, will you find any operational definition of sovereignty. Although the peace operation is mandated to work on it, you're never going to find a place where it's defined. You're never going to find a place that says, well, if you do these things, then you will have been successful. There is sort of a broad consensus, poorly defined but reasonably well agreed to, that a peace operation is successful if it is self-obsolescing, if it restores the capacity of the state to maintain security and public order within its own territory without external assistance. But if you want to get at that, and this is really where the political science started coming in, if you want to get at that, then you have to have a definition for what sovereignty looks like. Which is why I went for the book, because Stephen Krasner is the primary source I rely on for that framework. And Krasner defines sovereignty as having 3 or 4 aspects. So there's the international legal sovereignty, which is sort of the outward-facing aspect of sovereignty. There's Westphalian sovereignty, which is the ability to exclude any external actor from having power or influence within the internal decision-making process. And then there's domestic sovereignty, which is the extent to which you have authority over your own territory, and that authority is perceived as legitimate by those who are subject to that authority. And when you really get into the third one, right, because you can't really define Westphalian sovereignty, which is excluding other actors from the internal processes, without a definition of what the internal processes are. And so the internal processes of domestic sovereignty, what's normally seen as the domain of the state in political science, is, again, something that's very widely studied with very little consensus on what makes it up. But broadly speaking, you reach the authority or the monopoly of force within that territory. You reach some notion of social contract or outcome legitimacy, which is sort of the things that the state is supposed to do to deliver security, rule of law, public infrastructure, in exchange for the fact that you're willing to tolerate them being the only people who get to use force and raise taxes and things like that. And there's some notion of process legitimacy, of how do they come to gain and exercise this authority. And the piece that's interesting to me is that peace operations are really being mandated to go in and do all of these things, to help restore the monopoly of force, to help restore some sort of process legitimacy by building inclusive political processes, and to help restore some sort of outcome legitimacy by assisting with the provision of governance and building state capacity to provide governance after the peace operation has left. So Krasner makes this very important point when he's talking about the aspects of sovereignty, where he says all of these are ideal types. None of them exist in fact. There is no state whatsoever on earth that is actually 100% domestically sovereign, let alone a Westphalian sovereign. And peacekeeping is the primary mechanism through which the international organization is participating in that process of multi-level governance. And if that's the case, if this negotiation is not just about mandates, not just about consent from state and non-state actors to mandates, but about the very components of sovereignty itself, then the peace operation is actually daily renegotiating the sovereignty of the state. The final piece of the argument is a paper by my thesis advisor, Ian Johnstone, on the operational activities of international organizations. Johnstone's argument is that the operational activities of international organizations can constitute international law in such circumstances where the norm in international law is established but inchoate. So we know the norm exists, sovereignty. Everyone agrees there are such things as sovereign states. But it's inchoate. We don't actually know what makes up the norm. We don't actually know what sovereignty looks like in practice. Well, it so happens that you have an international organization that has been mandated to work on that very norm day in and day out. And if you have any sense of how international law comes into being, frequency of practice, as well as the belief that you are exercising that particular act as a matter of duty, as a matter of legal duty, as a matter of your mandate, are both important elements. So no matter what a state says it thinks sovereignty is, they are never going to be as frequent in that interpretation or as fervent in that belief as an international organization whose job is to constantly reinterpret and renegotiate that thing. What this suggests is that you have a very well-established but thoroughly inchoate norm of sovereignty, and you have an international organization created by sovereign states, which every day is softening that norm, is hollowing out that norm, is reinterpreting that norm to mean that the domain of the state is something less than the full ideal type of the sovereign state. If anyone's familiar with the work of David Keane on Sierra Leone, or more generally on political economy and conflict, he argues that such categories as state and non-state, conflict, post-conflict, are arbitrary and of limited usefulness. Because there are patterns of continuity in both violence and order on either side of those categories. And so he argues that if you want to study the effect of a particular dynamic, what you really want to look at is those patterns of continuity and change, and the particular place where you think that one transforms into the other is not particularly important. It's almost arbitrary. And I think that it's possible to extend that out and say that at some point of time, this process of renegotiating sovereignty in practice will refract back into the law and will actually change the conception of what sovereignty is, which when you say that today, if you said that in like the UN Security Council, would be an uproar, right? It would be like, no, of course not. Sovereign states, always sovereign. When it actually happens, it will be with a whimper, not with a bang, because the continuity has already been established. The process of renegotiation has already been underway. Because the reality is that states do not practice sovereignty in the way that they profess it anyway. The other reason I picked up the book, and I'll stop there, is because Krasner's subtitle on the book is Sovereignty as Organized Hypocrisy.
Thank you very much for two additional very interesting presentations.